Hi, and welcome to the Two Texts podcast. I'm here with my co-host John Andrews, and my name is David Harvey. This is a podcast of two friends from two different countries, meeting every 2 weeks to talk about the Bible. Each week we pick one text to talk about, which invariably leads us to talking about two texts, and often many more. This season we're taking a long, slow journey through the book of Acts to explore how the first Christians encountered the disruptive presence of the Holy Spirit. John, we have Paul arguing about Roman citizenship, or at least asking that his rights as a Roman citizen are protected in Acts 22 and 23. And it's a fascinating text, actually, because as we talked about in our last episode, we've got this moment where Paul is pointing out that he's being treated unjustly as a Roman citizen. And of course we would say, and I think Paul means this to be seen as well, is actually probably being treated unjustly as a person, therefore, regardless of his citizenship. But this is also happening, this very layered debate, where on one hand, Paul's arguing with his Jewish community about what he's doing while facing threat from the wider Roman Empire. And we talked the last time about how we need a nuanced read of the Roman Empire so that while it's clear Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not, and the New Testament's unequivocal on that,
True.
There is a way of seeing the empire that has the nuance of there being good people in a system that we would roundly disagree with. I think nuance is important because we then now come into a conversation that you're going to read for us today between Pharisees and Sadducees and Paul. And again, it'd be so easy just to brushstroke good guys and bad guys in a story like this and do great damage to the witness of Jesus and the church. So it's almost as if Luke brings us into a period where read carefully, read slowly, don't speak in absolutes, don't stereotype and just whitewash the situation. Actually pay attention to the nuance of this particular moment and hold it there. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes total sense. I think as humans, we are very, very, very prone. I hope I'm not making a generalization by making this point. We're very prone to make generalizations. I mean, I really do think that's one of our dangers. And I think even with all our sophistication in the 21st century, you just follow a little bit of the conversation on X or you look at some of the stuff that's out there, and actually we're still falling into that trap of generalizations, stereotypes, judging people, judging groups, judging nations from a distance, making sweeping statements that are unqualified and carry with them huge risk. And these great statements, of course, these big brushstroke statements can win points for us. They can get certain people up on their feet and clapping their hands, but they don't actually help us live well. They don't. They tend to polarize us. They tend to drive the conversation by fear, by extremes, and we end up then with a sort of a dehumanization of people rather than an understanding of what is going on. And again, the minute anyone who's hung around the New Testament hears the term Sanhedrin, Sadducee, Pharisee, our great temptation is we group all of these people together into one lump, and we assume that some of the things being expressed negatively or anti-Jesus or anti-church are therefore typical of all, which of course we know even from a careful reading of the Gospels. And earlier on here, in just a few podcasts ago, we talked about James telling us that many, many followers and priests were becoming followers of Jesus. So there's a Jesus movement growing in Jerusalem, but of course you're still grappling with the old power structures which are in play. And as we talked about the tension between empire and citizenship of the kingdom of heaven in the previous podcast, you've now got the tension of religion and citizenship of the kingdom of heaven. It's the same idea, just wearing a different jacket, I think.
Yes. No, I fully agree with you, and that's why it's amazing to me how often these ancient old texts like Acts, are helping us with X.
True.
That here you are reading, reading Paul's behavior and thinking, my goodness, if more of us behaved like this on Instagram or our blogs, how much better would we be?
Yeah.
And I think our listeners hear us well when we say that. That's not to say that there aren't terrible things happening. The Roman Empire was a barbaric, evil empire, right? But here you have so many stories of people who still we find good people in this. Jesus is amazed at the faith of a centurion. And that's what nerves me out, is in the brushstrokes, we miss the humans. And perhaps I'd say it like this, that one of the great tricks of the devil, I think, and I do think there's a diabolical element to it, is that sin dehumanizes us, right? And Jesus draws us back to our humanity and draws us back to our fully humanness. And the easiest way to hate someone is to dehumanize them.
True.
And so it's so easy to just go, the Romans, a little Monty Python-esque perhaps, but what have the Romans ever done for us? That sort of thing. And that's, and you pick anybody that's being shouted at on Twitter, and that's what's happening. I guarantee that whenever you see evil things said about a people group or a person, some dehumanizing is happening.
Yeah,
and again, just to restate, I'm not saying that evil things don't happen, the furthest from what I'm trying to say. No. But the way of Jesus is not to see people as groups, right? Yeah. But to see them as people made in God's image, hurting sometimes hurting themselves and others. And I think that's what we see in Paul, is this remarkable ability, like to save the jailer's life in Acts 16, right? This is the gospel, is to see you as a person in the image of God.
Beautiful. So shall I jump in and read our next little bit for us? Yes. This will take us from the end of chapter 22, and we're now into chapter 23. We're into a new chapter. Come on now. We can do this. Here we go. So I'll read from verse 30 if any of our listeners are tracking with us. And here we go. So the commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. So the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." At this, the high priest, Ananias, ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewash wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck." Those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you insult God's high priest?" Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize that it was the high priest, for it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, and that there is neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe all these things. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, stood up and argued vigorously. "We find nothing wrong with this man," they said. "What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. The following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." Oh. I'm sorry about the laugh out loud moments ago.
Yeah, there is quite a few quite interesting moments here, aren't there? And bearing in mind, I mean, I'm trying to stitch all of these things together that Luke is allowing us to see. I'm struck if we go right the way back to a line that has appeared a couple of times in this incident. So way back to chapter 22, verse 22, rid the earth of him, he's not fit to live. But of course, the Greek there is lift him up from the earth, right?
Yeah.
We talked about this a few episodes ago, but the allusion to the Jesus story is so strong that this crowd are like take him up from the earth, lift him up from the earth. He's not fit to live, which is again stunning statement given that he is literally going around the world offering life in Jesus. Then there's this question of his identity. I am a Roman citizen, right? And then now Paul, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. Now, so this is fascinating. He's born a Roman citizen, right?
Yep.
And he's born into a descent of Pharisees, and so look at the layers. He's being identified alongside Jesus inadvertently, lift him up from the earth.
Yep.
He's a Pharisee and a Roman citizen. The whole nature of Paul's identity is really a significant part of this story, isn't it? Of Paul being formed, and this is why we said it in the last episode. As he says himself in Galatians, set apart from my mother's womb. We're seeing Paul is trying to show his identity as something very much he's been given from multiple species.
Yeah, completely. And seems to be deeply comfortable with all of those. It's not like he's shuffling one thing out of a pack and sort of playing a card and going, oh yeah, well, it's actually, this is who he is. And this is the appropriate moment to let people know that this is who I am, rather than he's sort of manipulating or using these insights or these sort of, let me use the term, identities. I don't mean that, but his identity is complex in the context of this. And of course, the similarities here around Jesus are really striking. And of course, just as Jesus found himself before the Sanhedrin, with the potential of his life on the line, so now Paul also finds himself here. And it's interesting why, again, going back to our conversation on our last podcast, the commander wanted to find exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. So this is a man, I mean, as a Roman commander, he could just chalk this down to inter-Jewish strife. I've had enough of these people. Just get rid of them. Just get them out the door. But something is going on in the commander that makes him take a particular interest in Paul, and he wants to find out exactly what the problem is. So again, I think going back to the way Paul has played the whole thing, the way he's responded and reacted to the whole thing from the very moment they try to kill him in the temple courts, and he's dragged away by the Romans, and then he makes his speech, and then he's dragged off to be interrogated, and then he declares himself a Roman citizen. And even the way the commander is treating him, I mean, I love the way it was sort of introduced there too, is that actually, the commander had Paul released. He wasn't brought down in the implication. He wasn't brought down in chains, but actually he's brought down before. There's a sense in which the commander is trusting him. So it's like Paul has almost endeared himself to this commander, and maybe it's because this man is seeing this guy's quite unusual. He's Jewish. He's a Roman citizen. He can speak multiple languages, and he's engaged him. So he finds himself sort of in the middle of the Sanhedrin in one respect because of the way he's engaged with this Roman commander, and this Roman commander is keen to get to the bottom of the issue.
Yeah, I think this is Paul, though. In one sense, he is very good with people, right? And he's. It's interesting how our representation of Paul, so often we think about him as this fiery, but he also knows how to work a crowd. He knows how to talk to people in such a way that, again, I'm not wanting to overlabor the point. it's not lost on me that it's Paul that becomes the one that takes the gospel into so many areas of Europe. He knows how to speak well. And I almost think it's interesting that the violence that's done to him is he is struck in the mouth, right?
Yeah.
Like Paul is a speaker. He's been sent with a message. And look at the towards the end of the story, the Lord stands near Paul. You must testify, right?
Yeah.
So
beautiful.
I might be seeing something that's not there, John. So please, push back. But it just strikes me that the story is culminating in the Lord saying, "Testify, Paul," and this image of the high priest ordering him to be struck in the mouth.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you have any reflection on that, or do you think I'm clutching at straws?
No. I thought that was striking. That actually you get in one sense the Sanhedrin trying to curtail, control, shut him up, or intimidate him, and then by the end of this little encounter, you've got Jesus empowering him and helping him. And I noticed something else. The high priest commanded those who stood by him to hit him on the mouth. So it's interesting, you get a double expression, or you get the one standing by him are to hit him on the mouth, and then later on it says in verse 11, the Lord stood by him and said, "Speak, be of good cheer." So it's almost Jesus is undoing what has been done to him in that. And I thought that was a lovely little connection. So I don't think you're overcooking that at all. I think even the way it's written, there's an allusion to the one standing near struck, to the one standing near empowered, and encouraged him to speak and bear witness, which is beautiful. And of course, not only in Jerusalem, but to Rome. So interestingly, this idea that there's an attempt to silence him in Jerusalem, and Jesus is saying to him, "No, you're actually gonna speak this word in the very heart of Rome itself," which of course the Book of Acts shows us literally happens.
And there's a couple of interesting things as well in relation to the conversations we've been having, like in verse 5, when Paul becomes aware that it's the high priest that he's talking to. You get this line from Exodus, "Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people," right? Which we talked in the last episode about Paul's ability to navigate the complexity of an empire which is so barbaric like the Romans. And we talked about Romans 13, even when Paul says things which have caused Christians a lot of problems about how we trust authorities when so often they seem untrustworthy. And here you see perhaps a little insight into Paul's core ideas, that as he doesn't want to speak evil about those in authority, which again, like, what a great piece of biblical text for our modern era, right?
Yeah, because it could be argued, of course, that Ananias himself was acting in contrary to Torah. So there is a reflection from Leviticus that would say, do no unrighteousness in judgment.
Yes,
and this is clearly an unrighteous act. There's no reason or justification for this action. It's quite brutal, actually, when you consider. And again, here's the beautiful juxtaposition. You've just had Paul dealing with Romans. Now, I know the Romans were going to interrogate him, and that would have been quite brutal. But actually, once the Romans found out who he was, they took their hands off him. And they treat him with total dignity and respect. And in fact, even unbind him so that he can stand before the Sanhedrin. Ironically, then, he stands in what could be argued is sacred company of men of God. And the first thing he experiences in the company of men of God is a dig in the gob, a dig in the mouth. And you're sort of going, whoa, that's an interesting little juxtaposition, isn't it?
Yes.
Where the commander has been treating Paul with dignity, and we'll see even more so. But the first reaction of the leader of Sanhedrin is to exact violence and unrighteous violence on Paul. And I think that's why Paul reacts the way he reacts. And it's interesting, Paul's reaction has an echo of the words of Jesus as well, the whole whitewashed malarkey going on there. So you get this sort of sense of, of a certainly an echo of something that even Jesus said, a whited wall to sit in judgment me after the law. When you've ordered me to be struck in contradiction to the law. So there's a lot going on there. But when Paul is confronted and he realizes it's the high priest, he backs off and shows respect and honor, having already made his point, I think.
I was curious to ask you actually about what you thought about the whitewashed wall, because obviously it is a Jesus reference that we get in Matthew, isn't it? Where Jesus, interestingly, of course, suggests to the scribes and the Pharisees that they are whitewashed walls. On the outside look beautiful, but inside full of bones. Whitewash. I mean, there's some translation challenges as to whether that whitewash is closer to what we mean by whitewash in the modern era, or even just it might be closer to a form of plastering, right? Where you basically just skim some sort of substance over the over some failing brick to help hold it together. It gives me flashbacks to buying my first house, where somebody had plastered over one of the rooms kind of badly, and then had tried to wallpaper it to cover it up. And I remember coming in to this house that looked old on the outside, and there was this lovely wallpapered room. And I remember saying, "Oh, you've wallpapered just recently," and I tapped the wall, and all you heard was like crumbling happening behind. Like I literally heard like stuff falling from behind the wallpaper. and the realtor looked at me and just was like, "So shall we go look somewhere else?" I was like, "Yeah, let's do that." But so whenever I hear this phrase of whitewashed walls, that you walk into this room that looks lovely, but if you even so much as just touch the wall, it's a bit of a mess. But I wondered about the Old Testament references that are going on in there, where Ezekiel speaks quite harshly in the language of whitewash or plaster, right? In Ezekiel 13, there's this, people are saying peace when there is no peace. And because when the people build a wall, these prophets smear whitewash on it. And it's this, again, this sort of narrative critique. And I was pondering whether, is Paul kind of referencing a Jesus quote that he knows because he stood with his fellow Pharisees, and Jesus is accused then of being like whitewashed walls. But maybe are Paul and Jesus both dragging out that Ezekiel reference of saying something to cover over what's actually true? Do you think those sort of resonances are? Because it's not a huge reference in Scripture. It's just there's this little bit in Ezekiel where that same sort of language is used.
Yes, absolutely. And I think what's interesting in the Ezekiel reference, it's the sort of condemning, in a sense, false prophets. And the verse 10 of Ezekiel 13, because they lead my people astray. And I think the commonality between Ezekiel's reference, the way Jesus uses the image, and even potentially the way Paul uses it here, is definitely, it's not, again, let's go back to our dehumanizing conversation. This is not just an attack on the religious institution or on certain people or the Sanhedrin even, but it's an attack on the way they are leading people. It's an attack on the fact that they are leading people astray. If you look at the Matthew 23 stuff, the 7 woes of Jesus, I mean, my goodness, echoes of Tanakh all over that. And then, of course, Luke's 6 woes. Jesus is essentially attacking the religious community for not being the shepherds and not being the type of leaders that they should be to the people. And I know we've reflected on that before. So the connection of Ezekiel 13 and the connection to Matthew 23, for example, and also into then this, I think the similarities are definitely worth noting because they're all connecting to the same idea. And if you look at Paul's language, like really carefully there. He talks about this whitewashed wall, and you sit judging me according to the law and violating the command to strike me. He's saying, hold on a minute, how dare you judge me? Because you're doing the very thing that the law forbids you to do, and you should know that. So again, he's challenging the incongruence. He's challenging the contradiction. He's not challenging the idea of Ananias's position as and within the Sanhedrin, but he is challenging his behavior within that. And I think the things are connected, David.
And that's what's going on in Ezekiel. Like in Ezekiel 22, the prophets are criticized as whitewashing because they're saying, "Thus says the Lord," but the Lord has not said thus. Right? And that's Ezekiel's critique, isn't it? So I just think Paul's so, like you, I think Paul's so embedded in the scriptural language that I think it's a very precise critique. It's the sort of critique. I think this is maybe what I'm trying to say. If Paul said to the Roman centurion that was flogging him, "You whitewashed wall," I think we would just say that's just a strange insult, right?
True.
I think to say in the Sanhedrin, "You whitewashed walls," right, I think is a very precise, loaded, and like surgery precision insult, if that makes sense.
Oh,
right?
Completely.
There's nobody standing there. Like I'm trying to think of an example. If you were to walk into the American Congress to make a speech about freedom and begin it with 80 years, these are sort of terms that are so well known that I don't think people can miss what Paul's saying. Now, an interesting thing that I think is also worth mentioning in this scene is, and maybe I'm saying something that doesn't need to be said here, John, but it always struck me since I went to a lecture at a university conference I was at some years ago, and somebody pointed something out that I've seen to be consistently true, that whenever you watch a movie about the Bible, the high priest is always walking around in their high priestly gear, right? Which the Bible clearly tells us they only wear when doing their ceremonial duties.
Indeed.
Right? So, like, for example, if you watch most of the crucifixion films you've ever seen, they knock at nighttime on the high priest's house, and he appears wearing all of the robes from the temple. And, it's funny, once you've seen that, I've just ruined so many movies for everybody, but once you see that, it's consistent. The high priest will be sat there with his hat and his, all of the tunics and everything like that on. The reason I bring it up is because what's fascinating here is in general day-to-day business, Paul doesn't even realize it's the high priest that he's talking to. It's just another member of the Sanhedrin, not in his ceremonial robes. And so, and maybe I don't need to say it, but I think if you've only ever encountered the high priest in Bible movies, you read this story and like, how does Paul not know that that's the high priest that's talking to him? And I think it's worth noting that there is, even as the high priest, he would just be dressed normally on a day like this.
Yes, completely. And therefore his reaction wasn't personal. I think his reaction was to being struck, which was a violation of the law. And therefore it's when it's pointed out to him that it was, the high priest he spoke to. Then he goes, okay, then I apologize because I don't want to speak against my ruler. But of course, what he's done brilliantly, he has made his point. It's one of those things, once your point is made, it isn't unmade, is it?
It's funny how exactly to what you're saying, he basically says, I didn't realize it was the high priest and I shouldn't speak evil about the ruler of my people. But he doesn't say, and therefore I'm sorry I said that, or therefore what I said was untrue, or therefore what I said was wrong. He just moves on. And actually, as we'll see just in a minute, picks a different fight, essentially.
It does. It's very clever. Actually, it's again, we've seen this in Paul before, where his ability to negotiate very, very difficult moments. I mean, we've already seen him in the temple just a few chapters ago, where the man was in an inch of getting his life taken, and yet he has the composure to respond, to speak, to engage a crowd. He's about to be tortured by the Romans, and he, just at the right moment, he drops in, "Oh, by the way, do you know I'm a Roman citizen?" and he just seems to be, and he reads the situation super quickly here and understands that probably having been struck and then being told what he's been told, he knows there's no way he's going to be listened to here. There's no way he's going to get a fair crack at the whip sort of thing. There's no way he's going to get a fair hearing. So he then drops this, hand grenade into the room, essentially, which creates this sort of chaos, which Paul may have wanted to create. I hope I'm not stretching this too far or making Paul sound sort of nasty or conceited or contriving here. But actually, if you look across the room and you realize no one's going to listen to me here, I don't think I'm going to get a fair hearing, then he makes a decision after having his face punched. Right, okay, I'm not going to place my argument in front of these people, but instead I'll create a moment of controversy. Now, this could be, if you want to be super generous, this is accidental. Paul just happens to say what he says, and everything he says is true. Or actually, the text seems to suggest then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and others Pharisees, called out. So it does seem to be a definite strategy of Paul to divide the room and perhaps deflect the room from him and create an opportunity perhaps that doesn't seem to be there at the beginning of the conversation. I don't know.
I think there's so much to learn from this passage for our own modern lives about just knowing a fight that's going nowhere, or in Paul's case, knowing a fight that's going to get you killed, because as the commander realizes by the end, my goodness, and I think when I read this text, there's a couple of things I think, maybe just clarifying a few things for our listeners to begin with. I mean, this is one of the debates between Pharisees and Sadducees, isn't it? It is. It's not. So, Luke tells us the Pharisees say one thing, the Sadducees say a different thing about resurrection. But I wouldn't want people to minimize. This isn't like a minor point of contention between Pharisees and Sadducees. This, at some level, I'd even go as far as to say this might be why there is Pharisees and Sadducees. That one group developed this idea of no resurrection, and one group developed the idea that there is a resurrection. So this is the thing that divides them. And so Paul's awareness of that, I think, is interesting. Paul's knowledge that this is the sort of thing that they're going to fall out about is significant. So holding all of that in mind, and we also then see, actually, maybe just to say more on that, notice then that the Pharisees are so often presented by modern readers as the sort of bad guys of the story. Theologically, they are the closest to the Christians, right? They're the ones that are actually, and this might be why they're always hanging around Jesus, because Jesus is saying a lot that they say. Paul is a Pharisee himself, and these things sort of make sense to them. So all of that said, when I read this text, John, I'm sort of reminded of, Paul reminds me of Jesus again, right? So I was thinking about the situation where the Pharisees and scribes, I think it is, forgive me, I can't remember the exact reference, come to Jesus for an argument. And he says to them, okay, well, what about John the Baptist? What do you think he was, from God or not from God? Right? And they have a little conflab amongst themselves and go, well, the problem is, if we say this, this will happen. If we say that, that'll happen, and they kind of just like give up on, So we've seen Jesus sometimes, and maybe this is a lesson for us as apologists even. Jesus seems able to spot, forgive the metaphor, a sort of dead horse conversation. Yeah. This isn't going anywhere. You're asking one thing, but you're not actually asking that. You're trying to get to something else. Jesus seems to be able to sense a mob. And it's interesting that Jesus rarely tries to argue with the mob, right? Which Paul maybe isn't learning quite as quickly as Jesus. So So Jesus does stuff that sometimes to us it looks harsh. Like, why did you not answer those questions? Why not correct those people's thinking? But of course, we know Jesus knows the heart. So it's almost as if Jesus can realize, you know what, you guys just try and be clever and try and show off. I'm just gonna give you something that you're not gonna be able to agree on and move on. I wonder if that's exactly what's going on here with Paul. Is exactly that. In the way of Jesus, like, wait a minute, this is not going well for me at all. I'm just going to get them fighting amongst themselves, and I'll hopefully sneak out the back door or something like that. And it just explodes to the point that Paul ends up rearrested. And, because as you pointed out, he was free, wasn't he? He was released to do this, and the centurion steps back in and, rescues him.
No. I totally agree, and I think Paul is being very deliberate. Whether this is reaction to the way he's been treated, and therefore he reaches for the nuclear option here, or whether this was always in his mind when he went in, it's hard to tell. We don't know, but it is in terms of deflection, it's brilliant, and it does. It does, and I do think there are moments where we do have to recognize discretion is the better part of valor. That there are moments where actually, if I climb into this is going to go nowhere. This is not going to be received well. There isn't the appetite to talk or listen, and actually, sometimes we need to step away from that. Or we need to actually recognize that sometimes people don't want to actually hear what we have to say. And I think that's what Paul's doing here. I've no problem with that. I don't think there's cynicism here. I think he's just playing the audience as he finds it. And I think his strategy of throwing the hand grenade in and allowing that to create the explosive reaction that it would create, it works. It definitely works. And of course, what happens is he's then taken out of harm's way and back into Roman custody. Whereas as a Roman citizen, he will be afforded full protection. And again, if Paul already knows, the Roman commander knows, I haven't done anything by Roman law that is illegal, therefore not punishable. But the Roman commander has exposed me to the Sanhedrin because he understands it's an issue of Jewish law. If then the result of the argument with the Sanhedrin is it confirms the Roman commander that this is an issue of Jewish law, then Paul can rely on Roman protection because he hasn't done anything to break Roman law. So actually, it's a very, very clever strategy. It's potentially allowing, ironically, the Romans, who will later on persecute followers of Jesus, it allows this follower of Jesus to actually find protection under Rome, so that he can carry the gospel of Jesus Christ to the rest of the world. And I think that's so clever from Paul. He stays within the bounds of Roman legality, and he shows the commander that the issue is an argument about the Bible, essentially, and one slightly out of the domain of the Roman commander. And therefore, the Roman commander feels both obligated and also required by law to step in and protect a Roman citizen who hasn't broken the law.
Yes.
So it's quite clever, really. It looks random, and it might be random, it might be reactionary, or knowing Paul and how clever Paul was, I wouldn't put it past him that this may have been in the back of his mind, or at least a strategy in the back pocket that he reaches for in order to help himself and deflect the Sanhedrin from him.
And there's just one other thing I just want to squeeze in, John, if we have time to talk about it, is that there's 2 points of argument go on, or of explosion, let's say. There's multiple points of argument. The one point we mentioned a little while ago, and we alluded to it in the last episode and mentioned it the week before. So Acts 22, verse 21, the Lord said to me, "Go, I will send you away to the Gentiles," right? And this is when the crowd raised their voice and went, okay, let's get rid of them. Paul goes through the flogging with the centurion as a result of that. And then now here we have Paul saying, I am on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead, right? And one of the things I just want to point out to our listeners is that those two ideas are the two sparks that cause both of the uproars.
Indeed.
But actually, in Paul's theological position, those two ideas are very, very closely related, right? And the resurrection of Jesus for Paul is the fulfillment of the hope of the resurrection that he as a Pharisee would develop as an idea from Ezekiel 37. Right? And Ezekiel 37, the valley of the dry bones, the resurrection there is a metaphor to the prophet of God's return of the people from exile, the return and the reestablishment of these people. But of course, in the prophetic tradition of Israel, when Israel is redeemed, Israel's new job now is to summon the Gentiles into the worship of the Lord. So for Paul in his life, the resurrection of Jesus has always seems to be seen to Paul as, because Jesus is raised, I must go to the Gentiles. And it's fascinating to me that Luke tells us the story in such a way that we see that the two big sticking points are the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection, right? But the Pharisees actually don't like the implications of the resurrection.
Very good. Very good.
They believe, they're saying, well, maybe an angel spoke to him, maybe the Lord spoke to him. They don't want to give up on resurrection, but they don't like the implications of if there is a resurrection, that means the Gentiles, and that's what we're objecting to. So you're actually seeing on display two of the real tension points of early Christianity, and perhaps of all Christianity, this confession of the faith in the God who raises from the dead, and then this welcome of all people to come and worship that God. And these things for Paul are maybe going to get him killed, but for us are still the places of tension, the places of trust and faith that God can do what we could never imagine, and that he will do it with the very people that we think are outsiders. So that's it for this episode. We know that there's always more to explore, and we encourage you to dive into the text and do that. If you liked this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you rated, reviewed, or shared it. We also appreciate all of our listeners who financially support the show, sharing the weight of producing this podcast. If you'd like to support the show, visit twotexts.com. But that is all for now. So until next time, from John and I, goodbye.